مصلحا ومجددا فارنوا بنظر طاهر وجنان.
I'm doing well.
Alhamdulillah. So let's get started. Our first question for you is, what is your name and background?
I was born Jonathan Ghaffar, or Jonathan Gaff. I'm so used to Ghaffar now. But my Muslim name is Muhammad Abdul Ghaffar legally, and I go by Jonathan Ghaffar, or Jonathan M.A. Ghaffar when I write, so I don't scare people.
And what's your background?
I can't say I was ever like a Christian really, but I spent most of my teenage years up till I was 31 technically as a Taoist, which is like Chinese philosophy. So I never, this is the funny thing, I never thought I'd ever joined an organized religion, Christianity or Islam or anything. So it was more of a shock to me when I read Muhammad Zafullah Khan's little booklet, The Message of Islam. And at the end of it, I'm like, oh my God, I'm a Muslim. So it was a big shock even to me, but it's one of those things where at that age, like I was 30, 31, I think, when I officially, decided I want to be Muslim. Up until then, from the time I was about 15, I considered myself a Taoist. It's like Tao. You'll see that a lot in Chinese religion, philosophy, whatever. The Tao of this, the Tao of that. But Taoism was very easy to understand. It was, like there's a disclaimer in the very first chapter of the scripture of Taoism. It's called the Tao Te Ching. And it says the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. Like the map is not the territory. And I thought that was pretty refreshing because most religions are, it's our way or the highway. And if you don't believe like we do, you're going to hell, right? So I could never buy that, growing up. When I went to college, mostly Christians would have this attitude like, oh, you have to be our particular denomination of Christianity or you're going to hell. And I'm like, that's nuts. I mean, I could never accept a belief that God only loves like the Jews or only loves the Southern Baptists, or what I'm saying. It didn't make any sense. With like now 6-7 billion people, you figure God's got to love everybody and give them a path, right, to find Him, find God. And so when I'm studying Islam, it was like one of the things, these ideas that come in from Islam that I don't think you ever really hear about in other religions, was this is one thing that got my attention, where the Quran says God sent messengers to every group of people. So like when I do Tabligh a lot, and I remember like one of the things I tell people that I'm talking to is the more you study Islam, you realize it's the religion of duh, because everything is just common sense. And it's like, well, yeah, of course it should be that way. So for me, coming from Taoism, which is very philosophical, right, kind of cryptic, there's not a lot of do's and don'ts. It's like principles. And so I can remember, from I guess in my late 20s, Taoism was really kind of like not working for me in a sense. And I could understand why, for a lot of reasons, that it takes a real application of your focus spiritually to sort of get it. And it obviously helps if you can speak Chinese and understand it from the Chinese end of it, because a lot of it is like that, right? So I mean, I'm not saying it's faulty or anything, because I remember when I first met the fourth Khalifa about 9 months after I converted. I converted in January 22nd, 1994, and then the fourth Khalifa, may Allah bless him, he came to the mosque in Chino, California, which is outside of Los Angeles. And of course, I'm the new convert, so they bring me in. And I mean, I really had no appreciation or understanding of what a Khalifa was, or who this person was as the fourth Khalifa. And so one of the questions he asked me was, what were you before you joined, before you became Ahmadi? And I said, I was a Taoist. And I always have to explain what's a Taoist. And I'm expecting to have to explain to the Khalifa what's a Taoist. And he says to me, he goes, oh, old Taoism or new Taoism? And I was like, wow, the guy knows the difference. Old Taoism is philosophical Taoism. New Taoism is it's like religious Taoism. It's like ancestor worship and, lots of totemic kind of stuff. And it's not the real Taoism. And so the fourth Khalifa says to me, oh, that's proto-Islam, which it is. And so that really impressed me, because he's like the first person I've ever had to explain what Taoism is. And I never expected to hear that from him, a person who was a Muslim. So that really impressed me. And that was the beginning, essentially, of, my growing appreciation and love for the Caliphate through my experience with the Khalifa. I get off track easily. You're gonna have to bring me back to.
Yeah. So basically, how did you find Islam, Ahmadiyyat? What was your journey?
Right. So I was, searching without really knowing I was searching. And my belief is God always opens a door for you to bring you to the next level of your spiritual growth. And he never forces you to go through it, but he opens the door. So for me, right around this point in my life, my ex-wife, one of them, converted to Islam, the Ahmadiyya group. And so I remember she calls me up and she became a Muslim. She didn't tell me Ahmadi or anything. And my first reaction as kind of a regular Westerner was, what? Are you crazy? And so she sends me some information. She sent me like this booklet by Zafrullah Khan, The Message of Islam. And I can remember like, I'll read this, no big deal. And that's when my first kind of impression was, wow, this is really not what I expected. Because like I said, at the end of reading that book, I'm like, oh my God, I'm a Muslim. Because I agreed with everything that was being stated, only I understood it previously only from Chinese philosophy context. And so hearing it in this kind of Islamic context was really surprising. And I can just remember, like, aside from just being intrigued by the concepts and the information being presented, I was like really impressed by Muhammad Zafrullah Khan's writing. I mean, his level of writing was so, like lawyerly in terms of like very, very concise, very information dense, and very eloquent. I mean, he was a British taught, Pakistani or whatever. And so his command of the English language was very British. And slightly formal or even overly formal, but engaging. I mean, it's like when you read the Promised Messiah, you're reading essentially, British English translation of the Promised Messiah through Zafrullah Khan and these people. But I know that the ability of what the Promised Messiah communicates is exactly, if not more, obviously, that dense and concise and information packed. And that's also what impressed me, is reading philosophy, the teachings of Islam. That was like one of the main books that I was given, because I was near, at the time I was living in like near Northridge, California, where the earthquake was. This was like late 93, I think, and early 94. So they had a really massive earthquake. And so like that was one of the elements that kind of shook me to sort of realize, like, man, I better get my act together here. So it kind of pushed me in that direction of like, I need to commit. I need to like put up or shut up. And so things happened. Basically, I lost my job, and like I said, these doors closed, but then these other doors opened. And so I would talk to Imam I.H. Kauser, he was the imam in Chino, California at the Bethel Hamid Mosque at that time. You know, he would call me up, I would call him up after I finished whatever literature he had sent. So I remember I called him up. I said, yeah, I'm finished with that, whatever literature you had sent me. He said, you know, send me something else. So he sends me the philosophy of the teachings of Islam. And that's like the hit it out of the ballpark kind of book, which, you know, obviously all the people you've interviewed, they always mention that book as the thing that just blew them away. And because I didn't know who he was, I didn't understand who the Promised Messiah was or Ahmadi, anything like that. But I remember getting the book and I'm thinking, it's 120 pages. It's not that big. So I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to blow through this in a weekend. No big deal, right? Because I'd read, from the time I was a teenager, I'd read very, very intense, esoteric kind of spiritual stuff that was mostly Taoist or Buddhist. And I tell people, you know, I use this analogy all the time, Krishnamurti. Anybody who's ever read Krishnamurti knows, like, he's a really hard guy to read. So I had this kind of level of spiritual writings and books that I had read. And so I'm honestly not expecting a lot from this book, Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam, right? So I can just remember when I started the book, in the very beginning, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad makes this claim that this speech or this lecture that's going to be delivered at a World Religion Conference in Lahore is basically this book, Philosophy of Teachings. And he makes this statement like, this will be, you know, God has told me this will be the winning entry in this religious conference. And I'm thinking, oh man, that's a pretty brazen thing to say. You know, you're thinking, this guy must really think big of himself. And like I mentioned at the MKA Ijtima, where I spoke in 2015, this phrase came into my head where that kind of pronouncements sound like bragging if you don't understand the bravery of truth. That's the phrase I use, the bravery of truth. And it's demonstrated amply by the fact that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad never backed down from anybody, right? Sometimes I look at how some Ahmadis will be kind of skittish or like, oh, let's not upset these people and this and that. And I'm like, promises, I didn't worry about that. I mean, he told them the truth, you know, and it's like, hey, if it hurts, that's not my fault. And so anyway, I can remember, you know, starting to read this book, and really quickly by the, you know, in the first, I don't know, 10 pages or so, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad makes this statement about the three states of man, like spiritually, right? Like the self that incites to evil, the reproving self, and the soul at rest. And I was kind of like amazed at the fact that what brain science teaches you, because I studied a lot of science, and what Freud depicted in like the 1920s about the id, the ego, and the superego, maps directly onto the brain, what they call the brain physiognomy, of the fact that in your head, your brain is composed of three parts or three layers. And the first part is what's called the Reptilian Complex. And this is what Mirza Ghulam Ahmad talks about as the self that incites to evil. And, you know, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad didn't read Western science. He never read Freud. And for somebody to deduce from the Quran, which the Quran is pretty clear, obviously, and present these ideas about these three levels of your brain that cause you all this trouble, basically, not the first two. So you have the Reptilian Complex, which is like, they call it the Reptilian Complex because all it does is focus on fight or flight. Like you're physically threatened and your first reaction is to run away or to fight. It's only concerned with you staying alive. There's no morality in the reptilian brain, and all it focuses on is basically you staying alive, however you need to do that. Rape, murder, steal. There's no morality, and basically make copies of yourself. That's it. right? Self-preservation and the continuation of your genes are the only thing the reptilian complex is focused on. It's like a shark. A shark does two things. It never sleeps. All it does is eat and make little sharks. That's it. So part of your brain, the thing that causes you all the trouble, is that part of you, which makes you want to do what you want to do without any care for anybody else or any consequences even. And so immediately I could identify that from just brain physiognomy and what Freud basically said. And then the second brain is called the limbic system, which is the emotional brain. This is where mammals, things like that, have a limbic system. And that's the reproving self. It's that element where even a dog has this. If you have a dog and you scold the dog, what does it do? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It's sorry. So it's not a human thing where only humans feel bad about stuff. All animals in the mammal category go through this. Maybe not cats, because cats have no sense of remorse, but I could immediately identify that. Like, wow, this is 2 out of 3, and this guy's talking about Islam 1400 years ago, and they understood this. That just blew me away. And then the the third level is what we call the neocortex. This is the conscience and the consciousness of humans, where they know that they're unique, right? And that they have this ability to perceive that there's a higher reality. And that's what drives the spiritual impetus for people to find God, however you want to say it. But other creatures, as far as we know, don't do this. You don't have tigers or pandas or whoever walking around spouting philosophy or thinking about it. It never happens. But humans, because in theory this is like science would tell you, humans know we're going to die. We're the only creatures that we know of that have the foresight to see that we're not going to be immortal. And the standard psychological atheist kind of pronouncement is, oh, that's why you make up God. You create a God and a heaven because you don't want to die. And for a lot of people, they buy into that because it sounds very rational. Everyone's afraid to die. So what do? Oh, we believe in God, who's going to give us another chance or another life after we die, right? And so I kind of followed that line of thinking for a lot of my years because I didn't have any clear belief, you could say, in a higher being or a higher reality or whatever, right? That's why I was a Taoist. It was purely in this world philosophy that you could live your life by, and there wasn't any focus really on what happens when you die. And that appealed to me on one level because I couldn't answer the question. I didn't want to know for an answer. Who does? So that's what I find most interesting, is essentially Mirza Ghulam Ahmad writing this book in 1894, and he's talking about the 3 parts of your brain that control how you perceive the world, right? And when you think about it, the limbic system and the emotional system processes what your reptilian complex is doing, right? It justifies it. It doesn't like it. It feels bad. But it's the neocortex. It's the cerebral cortex, the front of your brain, that makes connections about things like philosophy and art and spirituality that the other 2 brains never do. And so, like, in science, they have a thing called the God spot, where if you stimulate it, it produces this mystical kind of one with the universe type experience, right? And so I look at it as the fact that God, like when the Quran says, this is another sentence in the Quran that just blew me away, was Allah is closer to you than your life artery. And I tell people, like, if you're not a Muslim or whatever, if all you did was focus on that sentence, you would get Islam, because it's the understanding, the awareness that it's not your inner shaitan that has ultimate power over you, you have to let it have power over you, and that's the Reptilian Complex. And that's why most people oscillate between doing bad stuff and then feeling bad about it. They just go back and forth, and they never elevate to the soul at rest. As Mirza Ghulam Ahmed describes essentially the cerebral cortex and the innate awareness that we have of being connected to this higher being, this higher reality that we call Allah, or they call God. And that sentence, Allah is closer to you than your life artery, is so clear because your life artery is just your physical body, what keeps you alive. So for him to be closer to you than that means he's closer to you than Shaitan, which is your reptilian complex. And that's so comforting.
So basically, after you became an Ahmadi Muslim, you had some challenges from the other Muslims who would mock you and say you're not a Muslim. So what happened after that, if you can describe that incident?
Because like, you know, how I explained that God guides you to the right door for you, to where you are. Because if I had been guided to Islam through like regular Sunni Islam or Shia Islam or, you know, whatever, or Wahhabi type Islam, I would have had a big problem right out of the gate, right? They'd be saying stuff that I'm like, you guys are nuts. So I really do believe that when I was sort of innerly seeking a higher spiritual reality, that God guided me straight to Ahmadiyya. So I consider myself very blessed. But what happened, two things. When I became Ahmadi, of course, I meet all these mostly Pakistanis at my mosque, and they're talking all the time, promise Messiah this and promise Messiah that. And I'm thinking, I thought Islam was about Holy Prophet Muhammad and the Holy Quran, the Sunnah, and whatever, the Hadith. And so I had a hard time kind of understanding their fixation for the promised Messiah. And so for me, as somebody who never accepted Christianity, right? I mean, I was like, what are you guys, why are you going on about the second coming of Jesus? I mean, so what? You know what I mean? I didn't get that. So on one level, like I sometimes remind devout Ahmadis, because naturally, and now I'm just like that. I mean, I'm talking about promised Messiah and the Imam Mahdi when I talk to Muslims all the time. And for Christians, hey, you know, because they go, have you accepted Jesus? I'm like, yeah, I accepted the first one 2,000 years ago as the Jewish Messiah, and I accepted the second one, the one you're waiting for. So you're like, you like missed the boat, dude. So but this whole kind of heavy concentration on, you know, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed was hard for me to get. So that's why it wasn't until I had this kind of spiritual experience that I relate in several other interviews about my sort of second conversion to Ahmadiyya. Because I say that when I first started studying Ahmadiyya, I studied it from Maulana Muhammad Ali's book, The Religion of Islam, and his translation of the Quran. And so, because I didn't know there was a Lahori Jamaat, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what Jamaat meant. So I thought when it said, you know, Anjum in Lahore, it was the Lahore chapter of, you know, Ahmadiyya, right? I didn't know there was two groups. And so it took me a while to kind of get that one and understand what that meant. But essentially, I read Religion of Islam, and I tell people, yeah, it's a good book. It'll teach you the nuts and bolts, the basics of Islam. It's just he wimps out, obviously, when he gets around to the Promised Messiah part. And his Quran, because he changed it, he wimps out when like 469, 470, when it says, you know, obey Allah and his messenger, and you will be among those who are on the right path. You know, the prophets, the martyrs, the truthful, the righteous, all that, right? And so that's the verse that came in significantly when I had my kind of spiritual experience, because like I said, I converted, you could say, intellectually. And so and I tell people this too, the first thing that got my attention in Islam was simply one word, which is Rab, which gets translated as Lord or Creator. And so when you read the whole definition of Rab, like in the commentary, it really presented to me the perfect definition of what Islam was designed to do, which was elevate you in stages to your perfection. Because the whole definition of Rab is he's the Lord, he's the Creator, he's the sustainer, keeps it going, he's the nourisher, that he keeps it growing, not just sitting there, and that he develops you through Islam in stages to your perfection. And this is the perfect definition of what people are really looking for in any religion, is does it do that? Is it more than just believe what we tell you and you get to go to heaven? That's basically Christianity. And so, not that I'm not trying to disparage Christians, because I tell people there are like 3 different kinds of Christians. And some of my, they'll joke, well, some of my best friends are black. Some of my best friends are Christian. And like, those are the people that I define as wanting to be Christ-like. That they don't preach to you about the doctrine, like you're going to hell if you don't accept Jesus. To me, real Christians are loving, and their focus with you is on your spiritual well-being, and in their sincerity of faith, they want you to be Christian. I understand that. But they don't like beat you over the head and say, oh, you don't believe what we tell you, you're going to hell. I mean, that's always the big threat. So I tell them, like, don't worry, I got my suntan lotion. Don't worry about it. But anyway, so there's that kind of Christian, which to me are the real Christians. And then there's the kind that want to preach to you and damn you to hell and this kind of stuff. And then there's the Christians that don't do nothing. They don't do anything. They show up for Christmas or whatever. And Muslims have the same problem, right? I mean, any religion will have these 3 categories of people. So I don't concern myself with the last group that don't do nothing. I don't generally worry about the second group that's going to damn me to hell. Because that's the challenge, right? Okay, here's what you say. I know the Bible pretty well. Show me where Jesus ever says this. He doesn't say it. And then, like I said, I focus on developing relationships with those Christians that are loving to all people, just like Jesus would have been, right? Like the old saying, what would Jesus do? Well, yeah, if Christians lived by that, there wouldn't be any religious wars and Christians killing people and whatever, right? It wouldn't happen. So, in that sense, of course, okay, Muslims have the same problem. And I deal with, even Ahmadis have the same problem, right? And so I deal with those Ahmadis like yourself that are sincere, they're devout. They're not like, like, hey, I'm better than you are because I'm a Pakistani, right? That's nonsense, right? Or I'm better than you because I'm not a born Ahmadi. And I always tell people, like, all the people that accepted Mirza Ghulam Muhammad as Imam Mahdi, what were they? And that just kind of stops them, because they're like, yeah, that's right. They weren't born Ahmadis. They were Sunnis or Shias or whatever. And they converted to Ahmadiyya. I tell Ahmadis all the time, every Ahmadi has to be a convert. Any commandment in Islam always is that kind of thing. It's like, don't drink, right? In America, we say, oh, don't drink and drive. Like that ever works. Islam says, don't drink. Duh. But anyway, getting back to what you were asking me about how I was received by other Muslims, and this is what really cracks me up. Of course, I got the hat on. I'm wearing the shawakamis. I'm like proud to be a Muslim. I'm talking to everybody about how great Islam is. So of course I meet Muslims, regular Sunni Muslims, whatever. And because I'm a white guy, they're like, MashaAllah, give me a big hug. And they ask me, so what masjid do you go to? And I'm so naive. I'm like, what's a masjid? Because all I know is mosque. And so they ask me, okay, what mosque you go to? And I'm thinking, oh, I go to the one in Chino on Ramona Avenue. And so usually if they know what that is, they'll know it's the Qadiani mosque. So I remember the first time this like Sunni Muslim guy, whatever. He grabs me and he's like, "Oh no, brother, you can't go to that mosque. Those people aren't real Muslims." And I'm just looking at him like, "What are you talking about? I just did Ramadan with them. They fasted for 30 days. They did all the 5 daily prayers. They did Tarawih. They did Tahajjud. They say the kalima. It's the same kalima I've read in any Muslim book, right?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" But they could never tell me. They just told me, "Oh, stay away from them. Don't read their books. That's the good one. You know, don't let them brainwash you." I'm just cracking up because, like, you know, the story of every dictatorship is don't read books that are going to criticize the government or, you know, whatever, right? So that's the joke. You want your kid to read a book? Tell him he can't. Oh my God, it's the first thing he'll do. So in that sense, that same thing works with many Muslims, many people that become Ahmadi. They're told, "Oh, watch out for these Mirzais, these Qadianis, these Ahmadiyyas. Stay away from them. Whatever you do, don't read their books." So, I love it because it's like free advertising. Because people that got a brain and aren't led around by the nose by some mullah, the first thing they're going to do is like, "Really? You don't want me to read this? Gee, let me check this out." And they do. And, you know, anybody with an open heart and an open mind, that's what I tell them, you cannot fail to see the truth in what Ahmadiyya preaches. And because there's none of the nonsense in it that other branches of Islam will tell you, like if they had told me if I'd become a Sunni or something, and I asked them, like, "Okay, what's with Jesus? What do you guys believe about Jesus?" And of course they'd say, "Oh, we love Jesus. You know, there's a whole chapter about his mother in the Quran." I'm like, you know, all this good stuff. Jesus is married. Jesus is mentioned more than Muhammad, right? I think Moses is mentioned more. And so clearly, you know, you cannot paint a picture where Muslims hate Jesus. They don't. But then the standard Muslim belief across the Muslim world, except for us, is, "Oh yeah, God took Jesus alive into heaven and he's going to come back down again." And they put somebody else on the cross and made him look like Jesus. That's the substitution theory. And if they had told me that, I would have dismissed Islam immediately. It's like, you guys are nuts, you know, because when I wasn't a Muslim, I viewed the crucifixion as a political assassination. That's it. The Jews didn't like him because he was preaching Reformation and, you know, turn the other cheek and get your act together, and my kingdom is not of this earth. Like all the Jews wanted was their land back, right? They wanted God to make a King David with a sword to come back and run the Romans out of Jerusalem. That's what they wanted. And Jesus is like, "No, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to fix you people because you're the problem." And of course they didn't want to hear that, so they arranged to have him put to death on the cross as a criminal in the state, you know, under state law. Because I ask Christians all the time, "Do you know why Jesus was put to death?" And they always say, "Oh, he said he was God." I'm like, no, he never says that, but that's not why they put him to death. The Romans couldn't care less. They were polytheists. They believe in all kinds of gods. What's one more? No, they put him to death because the Jews charged him with claiming to be the king of the Jews. And that is sedition, treason against the Roman state. And they knew, Deuteronomy 21:23, if you claim to be a prophet of God and you're put to death accursed on a cross, then you are a false prophet. You know, you are not the true Messiah. And Jesus knew this. It's why when he talks to the enemy, you know, the Jews who didn't believe in him or follow him, he calls them an evil and adulterous generation. And you seek a sign, and I will only give you the sign of Jonah. I have yet to have any Christian look at that rationally and understand what it means. They always go, "Oh, it's just 3 days and 3 nights." I'm like, no. Jesus is insulting the Jews to a degree that you do not appreciate. To say that you are an adulterous generation is to say that you deserve to be put to death, because the punishment for adultery in Judaism is stoning to death. So he's slapping him in the face big time, and they know it. And so when Jesus tells them, I only give you the sign of Jonah, it's a second slap in the face, because every Jew knows Jonah was a prophet of God, which means Jesus is saying, I'm like Jonah. I'm a prophet of God. I'm the Messiah. Even more, I'm the Messiah. And just like Jonah went through this ordeal of being swallowed by a whale, usually they say it's a whale, and he survived it. Normally a fish swallows you and you come out the other end, right? You don't survive it. So anybody surviving crucifixion was unheard of, because if you were alive after they were done crucifying you and hanging up for like 3 or 4 days or a week, if you were still alive, they broke your legs to make sure that you died, because you can't hold yourself up and you die of asphyxiation. That's why you die from crucifixion. But it's not meant to be a quick death, right? It's a very slow death. You know, in sub-Saharan Africa, you could last a week, 10 days on a cross. It wasn't that unusual. So Jesus was a young guy, relatively, you know, he's about 40 years old, good health. He was a carpenter, you know, he did lots of outside work. And so the notion that he would have died in 3 hours or 6 hours, even Pilate, the guy that was his judge, marvels. Couldn't believe it, right? Because he's doing everything he can to get him off, to get Jesus free because of the dream that he has that don't have anything to do with the murder of this guy. And that's why Pilate washes his hands, you know, the symbolic, I wash my hands of the blood of this innocent man. And he says to the Jews, what do you say? And they say, this is recorded in the Bible, his blood is on us and on our progeny. It's why anti-Semitism exists, because of that sentence in the Bible. And the Christians have been really good at following through on that and, you know, persecuting and killing Jews for the last 2,000 years, right? So this whole element, essentially, of what Jesus says in the Bible and what Promised Messiah presents as what happened to Jesus, to me was just, you know, eye-opening, because I'm like, wow, you guys don't believe he died at all. That was the big shocker when I became an Ahmadi, was, you guys don't believe Jesus died? Really? Because I could never fathom it either. I just assumed he died, and that was it, right? It wasn't until I really started studying crucifixion, you know, like I tell people every year in the Philippines at Easter, dozens, if not hundreds of Filipinos get themselves crucified to suffer like Jesus. Not a single Filipino has ever died from it, right? There's some grandmother has had it done dozens of times. She's never died. You don't die from that. You don't die from being crucified. You die from asphyxiation, from wild animals eating you while you're on the cross. That's what you die from. Or they break your legs and then you bleed out, right? Because they break your thighs and they splinter your femur bones, and that severs your femoral arteries, and you bleed out, right? Plus you can't hold yourself up. Between those two things, you're dead. It's guaranteed. So the more I studied the actual crucifixion, plus I'd read the famous book, The Crucifixion by an Eyewitness, supposedly written by Essene brothers at the time. And I remember reading that and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. You know what I mean? So anyway, all of that stuff, to me, Jesus not dying on the cross was the most kind of unbelievable belief. Because I mean, I was like, what? Are you kidding me? But again, the more I study it, the more it's like really obvious. So I have running debates with Christians. You know, I meet a Christian guy, my friend Glenn, like once a week, and we are polar opposites in a lot of things, but we respect each other. We're both big history buffs. So he can mention something in history and I'll know what he's talking about. And I can mention something and he'll know what I'm talking about. And so we use this context of actual history to sort of keep us on the same playing field while we have really divergent theological beliefs. You know, he's an evangelical Christian and I'm not, you know, so, but anyway, So this element of how I was perceived by other Muslims and how they were trying to warn me away from being an Ahmadi or whatever. And then, of course, I ran into a couple of ex-Ahmadis, and they would tell me the same thing. Oh, Jamaat's all, it's all messed up and blah, blah, blah. And so I never saw that. I mean, I saw obviously some elements of racism, against Black people and even myself by some people. And it was like, my belief was I've never been somebody that joins something as a social organization or just to be one of the crowd. Or, I mean, I never cared what anybody thought. I didn't care what my family thought. My friends, I lost friends because, once I became a Muslim, of course, I'm telling them all. And so they would take this sort of 3 steps back kind of a thing, right? Which anyone who's converted to Islam, they know. It's like, especially if your family is really devoutly Christian or something, you get kicked out of the house. I mean, lots of the interviews you've done, God bless you, they're really great. And some of these converts report that same thing, is that the most hostility and blowback that they got was from their own family. And then, like, if you're a Sunni Muslim and you become an Ahmadi, same thing. Your family will disown you. Your wife will divorce you. You'll lose your job. So I kind of point out to people like, man, I really have a lot of respect, total respect for Pakistani Ahmadis in Pakistan. Because you are signing up literally for a death warrant if you become an Ahmadi in Pakistan. Because they'll kill you. You have that very real possibility that you're going to die. Or if at the very least, you're going to lose all of these worldly family connections that you rely on for your living, and you're going to lose all that. Really good chance, right? People who are in the military and politics, they lose their job, right? And so I remember reading one of Hazur's Friday sermons, just blew me away, because he mentioned this Ahmadi in Pakistan that has a dream where he's told tomorrow they're going to kill you. The anti-Ahmadis, how I tell people, like, they publish the names and addresses of our members, like, especially if you're in administration, Sadr, any Jamaat position, they'll publish your names in the newspapers or on leaflets and say, Wajibul Qatl, right? These people are deserving of death. And the state of Pakistan, it's like, yeah, there's probably 1,000 people going to line up to do that job. So this Ahmadi gets this dream where he's told they're going to kill you tomorrow. And he's got a choice. He can get out of Dodge. He can leave the town. He can go somewhere else, right? Save his life. What does he do? He makes sure all of his chanda is paid up. He gets his family together, tells them what's going to happen. And, of course, it's upsetting. And so the next morning or whatever, he tells them all before he gets killed, obviously. So next morning, gets a knock on his door, and he knows who it is. He's expecting it. He opens the door. There's a guy, with a gun, and he shoots him. And I'm like, I would hope and wish that I have that kind of fortitude, that if I get some kind of intimation that I'm going to get killed for my faith, that I don't run away from it, And so it's that faith, that strength of belief in Ahmadiyya that allows people to be brave in the face of certain death. You're going to die, but you don't let that little fact deter you from being true to your faith, right? And so, yeah, I mean, things like that. Like I said, this is why Ahmadis in Pakistan, I got all respect for them, because the problem with the West, America, is all of our Qudam have never lived in Pakistan. They don't have that appreciation for the pressure and the very real threat against them just because they're Ahmadi. Because here, the odds of that happening are almost non-existent. We had one doctor in Detroit in like the 1980s where he was assassinated because he was an Ahmadi. But relatively speaking, the cops are going to show up and they're going to take those guys away. They're going to arrest those people, not you. Anyway, so this is what I see. This is why I ignore, elements of racism within Jamaat, because I know worldwide, Pakistani is the minority, and other Ahmadis of different countries, they never exhibit this kind of, I don't know, whatever it is that makes them think, hey, I'm better than you, or whatever. You don't see it. I mean, I've met Ahmadis from probably dozens and dozens of countries: Ghana, Indonesia, Russia, all over the world. And they're always the same. I mean, you can just tell. Like, I can remember one of the first times I went to Jalsa in UK, you get out of the airport, you're in Heathrow, so you get off the plane and you walk around. And I remember I'm just looking around and I see this guy. And there's plenty of Pakistanis, in the airport, a lot. And, at the time there was one of these anti-Ahmadi kind of groups that were in the airport waiting for their mullah or something, because they had on the long Shir Alchemy type thing that goes all the way down to the feet, and they got the white hats. And you can just look at them and see, like, man, those guys are nut jobs. So I'm kind of looking around because I'm looking for people that are going to pick me up. So I look at this guy and I walk over to him and I go, "You're Ahmadi, aren't you?" he cracks up. He's like, "Yeah, how did you know?" I'm like, "Dude, I can just see it. You can just see it." And so that happened in Bangladesh when I went to the Ishlam in Bangladesh in like 2013. Same thing. Airport's full of Muslims, they all look the same. And I'm looking around, same thing happens. I see this one guy. I walk over to him. I go, "Are you Ahmadi?" He's like, "Yeah." Are you Brother Ghaffar? I'm like, "Yeah." So that kind of unspoken, it's like an aura. You know what I mean? It's like, this is why people that aren't Ahmadis, they're whatever they are, they're Americans, they're, white people, whatever, they're not Pakistanis. And I have dialogue with them, and I look at them, I go, "Dude, you are a natural, you are a natural Ahmadi, And they don't often know what I'm talking about, but I go, "Dude, you're already on the same page, you just don't know it." And so that form of tabligh is easy because you don't have to really convince them of much, you know what I mean? You just have to, like, I tell people, read the Quran, right? Read the Quran, and that should be enough, because you within a page, read Surah Fatiha and ask yourself, have you ever read anything like that in any religious book? And the answer is going to be no, you haven't. You've never read. I describe Surah Fatiha when I talk to non-Muslims. I go, it's like the preamble to the Constitution. It tells you in a very short amount of words what the principles are in the whole rest of the document. And that's true. That's why Surah Fatiha is called, the microcosm or the mother of the book, right? Because it is. And it's why, as Muslims, this is what's so hard to communicate, is until you practice Islam and you recite the prayers and you feel that kind of connection. And especially, like, what I tell people a lot is, because they're usually Christian or something, and I tell them, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get up in the middle of the night, put a towel on the floor, wash your hands and your face and all that, and then prostrate to the ground. Put your forehead on the ground, your hands and knees, and talk to God. And then I go, well, and ask him if that white guy, crazy white guy, is really true. Is what he's telling you really true? And I tell him, I go, believe me, if you ask God to show you, is Islam true? Is Ahmadiyya true, especially? you're going to get an answer, no doubt. But you got to be sincere. You can't just like give up after 5 minutes. You know what I mean? That's why they say 40 days. Within 40 days, you will definitely get some kind of a sign that you can't dismiss. So for me, because when I converted, I had accepted, what I considered Islam. So it wasn't like I had to be convinced that choosing Islam was wrong. I didn't believe that. But after, a couple of months of running into Sunni Muslims mostly, and everybody's telling me the same thing. Oh, Qadianis aren't real Muslims and blah, blah, blah. Then they're telling me all these crazy stories like we face Qadian when we pray and we have a different kalima. That's the one that cracks me up, right? Because I had 2 Pakistani guys come to the mosque, and we have the kalima on the front of the mosque, and they know it's an Ahmadi mosque. So they come in and they're standing in front of the mosque and they're looking up at the kalima. And they're looking at each other and looking at the kalima. And I walk up to them and I go, yeah, it's the same. Because they're expecting, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is the messenger of Allah. That's what they're expecting to see instead of Muhammad, Rasulullah. And so it's the same thing. And I tell them, yeah, and we're even praying in the right direction. And then they tell me things like, oh, they pay you to join and they give you a house and they give you money. And I'm like, really? I'm still waiting. And no one's giving me a house, they're asking me to pay them, Chanda. So that's kind of, in a very short amount of time, I was running into all these Muslims and they're all universally telling me the same thing. Ahmadiyya is a cult, and come back to the real Islam and stay away from us. So in the back of my head, because I know, you've got I use Scientology as the example, right, of people that go into Scientology, and it's basically just a money-making enterprise, right? People don't know where Scientology comes from. I love this because I grew up reading science fiction, and I know who L. Ron Hubbard is, and I know the story, the real story, not what they tell you in Scientology, the real story of how L. Ron Hubbard created Scientology. It's a great story. He's hanging out with all of his science fiction writing buddies, like Isaac Asimov and Bill Sprague de Camp and Robert Heinlein, all these really famous people. And so they have a conversation, what's the best way to make $1 million? L. Ron Hubbard says, start a religion. This is like in the 50s, like probably late 40s, early 50s. And so they all go, okay, smart guy, go do it. So he goes home and he writes Dianetics. This is the Bible of Scientology. I mean, that's all you got to know. I mean, if you ever read a little bit of Scientology, it's basically 1950s psychology, which is basically Jungian psychology and Skinnerian behaviorism and stuff like that. So it's pretty much nonsense. I mean, they're appealing to people that want a scientific explanation for God. Right? Anyway, but so again, I'm having these issues, and so I see we're up to an hour, more than that. Man, I can talk. I'll cut to the chase here. So I'm sort of in the back of my head. I'm like, am I in a cult? Are these other Muslims true when they tell me Ahmadiyya is false and Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is false, all that stuff? And so this is like literally like 3 months, January, February, March, April, 3 months to the date when I became Ahmadi, January 22nd, April 22nd. This is a great story because it involves Rahmat Jamal, who's a legend, African-American, the founder of the LA Jamaat. I was very blessed to have him as a mentor. If I get emotional, that's why, because he was a great guy. So anyway, he takes us and a bunch of the Qadam out for dinner one evening, and I had this experience, which I didn't put together till years later, but I had a 2-part experience. And so it was time for Maghrib. So I'm sitting next to Rahmat Jamal in his like Ford station wagon, and he's leading Maghrib. And so of course he recites it aloud, and I'm sitting there next to him, and this sensation, I experienced this sensation as he's reciting Surah Fatiha of it going down my throat like cool, sweet water, literally like I was drinking water. And I was so kind of amazed at the experience, I didn't think about it. And I'm just kind of going, wow, that's really cool. And, you know, we went and had dinner, and, you know, then we came back to the mosque, and it was late, and they had already done Isha. So it was just me, the Qadams, and Rahmat Jamal. So they did Isha. So at this point in my learning curve of Islam, I tell people it's really steep. I didn't know, I hadn't memorized the Arabic, so I couldn't do it in Arabic. Like when you do your fard prayer and stuff afterwards. So I would do it in English. And so at the same time, essentially in the back of my head is this kind of nagging doubt about, is Islam, Ahmadiyya, really Islam, or is it a cult? And so, like you did Brother Rahman Abdul Alim's interview, great guy, he's one of my best friends. And so the experience that he recounts, where he hears this voice on his left side telling him, you know, my son, ask me for anything and I'll give it to you. Like, you know, when I did a commentary right after his at the MKA Ijtima in 2015. So I joke like I didn't get the repeat performance. You know, 3 times he was asked, Raymond, you know, ask me for anything, I'll give it to you. I want to prove to you in my life. I joke with him, I go, dude, God says ask him for anything and all you want to do is stop smoking? Come on, man. I mean, I'd say get me out of here. Give me $1 million. I mean, you know. So all he wants to do is stop smoking. But he does. Next day, he don't smoke no more. He hasn't smoked since. And so my experience was very, very similar to that because it was audible. And that's what kind of freaked me out. Because, okay, everybody does Isha. They do the sunnahs afterwards and all that. And they do Vitr. And I'm like really slow. So I'm like the last guy in the mosque. So I'm sitting there and I'm in the last rakat of the Vitr prayer. And when I come to the part of Surah Fatiha, it says, guide me in the right path, the path of those upon whom thou hast bestowed thy blessings. I'm sorry, I'm emotional, but so as soon as I say that, guide me in, you know, the path of those who have bestowed thy blessings. Right here on my left side, I hear the Ahmadiyya movement. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I look behind me. It's like somebody come in the mosque, I don't know, you know, because I wasn't doing this aloud. I was just reciting this English in my head. But right after I said, upon whom you have bestowed thy blessings, I hear the Ahmadiyya movement, which is what we called Ahmadiyya before they changed it to Ahmadiyya Muslim community. It was the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam. And so my first thought was like, man, what was that? And, you know, hairs on the back of my neck are all standing up. And I was like, I couldn't deny, you know, like, hey, am I hallucinating or where's this coming from? I couldn't deny that I had heard something, you know, whatever. It wasn't me. It wasn't me thinking in my head. I know that. So I didn't want to go tell Imam Kausar, like I'm hearing voices. I'm thinking, man, he's going to take my bayat for him and like rip it up in little pieces and say, you know, hit the road, Jack. But after a couple of days, I was like, man, I got to tell him because I don't know how to deal with this. So I go into his office. It was around Asr time. So first thing out of my mouth is, okay, I don't want you to think I'm crazy, but I relate what had happened to me, you know, 2-3 days earlier. Of course, you know, I'm Kausar, mashallah, he grabs the Quran and turns to like 470. And he shows it to me because I hadn't read this particular verse or read any commentary about it. This is why I say Maulana Muhammad Ali really wimps out on that particular verse. If you go look up his Quran, 469, 470, he totally wimps out. And he knows the truth. That's what's so bad. Anyway, so then Mom shows me, that you shall be on the path of those upon whom obey Allah and His Messenger. You will be on the path of those upon whom God has bestowed His blessings. And then it mentions the 4 categories: prophets, the righteous, the truthful, and the martyrs. And I see that word prophets. And I'm like, wow, like, oh my God, that's the answer. So I tell people, like, yeah, I joined Ahmadiyya twice. First time, January 22nd, just like intellectually, yeah, okay, this makes sense. But I had put the concept of who Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was on the back burner. I literally told myself, well, if this is a very spiritual teacher, he's really connected to God, and I don't know if I buy the claim that he's the second coming of Jesus and he's the Imam Mahdi, whatever that was. So I put it on the back burner, and I'm like, if this is the guy that brought this community into the world, I'd be like a real idiot to dismiss it just because I don't have all the answers or understand everything to a degree of certainty of faith. And so, because I've read a lot and I'm very, intellectual or whatever, I was thinking like, oh, this, maybe I read this somewhere. I don't know, but I don't have any memory or any experience where I can say I've read anything about like 470, 469. So that's what blew me away, because I get this communication that's a direct answer to the prayer in Surah Fatiha, and that answer is listed in 470. And it's like, if I had read that specifically, I could dismiss it. Oh, that's just sitting in my head and it popped out. But that didn't happen. And that's, to me, was my second sort of real conversion to Ahmadiyyat from the heart. Because I couldn't argue with that. I mean, I couldn't dismiss it as intellectualism or whatever. And so I tell people, like, yeah, I converted twice. And the second time made me a lifer, right? And so that's the element of conversion to anybody that has any type of very spiritual experience that convinces them of the truth of Ahmadiyyat, or they're guided to it. They'll see a picture of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad or a picture of the Khalifa, that kind of thing. And then a week later, somebody hands them a brochure and there's the picture. That stuff just don't happen unless it's from God. And like I mentioned before in other interviews, the anti-Ahmadi people, I tell them, has anybody ever had a dream or any vision where God's warned them away from Ahmadiyyat? Nobody's ever told me, yeah, they did. I go, so why is it millions of people across 100 and some years, I'm sure, have had these experiences where they're guided to Ahmadiyyat by God, by the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, by Jesus. I had a guy that converted Ahmadiyyat, and Jesus came to him and took him by the hand, took him into a room, and showed him the promised Messiah. That's my second coming, he's told. I'm like, how are you going to argue with that, right? You can't. So people that, get on me because, I'm on Facebook and I'm openly Ahmadi, and they're like, oh, you need to come to the real Islam. And I tell them, okay, first, this is my standard response. Show me a better Islam. Dead silence, because there ain't no better Islam. It's all messed up. So then I say, then I tell them, okay, go watch my my video on YouTube. You type MKA Jonathan Ghaffar, JONATHAN GHAFFAR. You type that on YouTube, and my video will come up. I tell them watch Brother Aleem's first because it's kind of a precursor. But I tell them, okay, you watch that video, it's like 20, 21, 22 minutes, and then you come back and you talk to me. and we can have this discussion. Not a single Muslim has ever gotten back in touch with me to convince me that I'm wrong, because you can't argue with a spiritual communication. And since then, like I said, I've had several of these type of experiences, and I take it literally as like in the Quran. I mean, I didn't find this out even till later. The 3 forms of communication from God or from angels, which is true dreams, waking visions, what they call from behind a veil. And it wasn't until I had this experience and I ran across that and I read the commentary and it said audible communication. And that just kind of blew me away, right? And so I have lots of, debates with Muslims that aren't Ahmadis, and they're like, well, show me in the Quran where another prophet can come or whatever. And I get so tired of like, don't you understand the difference between a law-bearing prophet and a follower prophet? Mystical Muhammad only said, I'm a follower prophet. Everything I get comes from Muhammad. So like, read a little, learn the definition and the difference, and like, stop giving me this no prophet after Muhammad business, because you don't know what you're talking about. So my favorite verse in the Quran, every time I get this, I love this. Very easy to find, 16:3 in our Quran, because we know the Bismillah, 16:3, but just open chapter 16 and you're going to see it right there, which says, Allah sends down angels with revelation upon whomsoever he chooses. He is the mighty, the wise. And I saw that and it said revelation. So I asked him, I'm like, is that what I think it is? And he goes, it's not law-bearing revelation. It doesn't replace the Quran. It's revelation that people that are spiritually inclined can get, like all messengers of God get this type of communication where they're guided by God. Like Imam Mahdi. What does Mahdi mean? It means guided. Who's guiding him? Duh. It's like, yeah, of course. So I use that verse all the time. I once had this like 45-minute argument with this Jordanian Muslim, because I'm a white guy. Oh, you don't know Islam. You don't know Arabic. No. He's just beating me up bad. I'm at the LA County Fair and I'm all by myself, and he's beating me up bad. So finally, in desperation, I show him 16:3, and I go, just tell me it doesn't say that in Arabic. That's all you got to do. He reads it once. His face gets all scrunched up. He reads it again. His face gets red. I go, dude, just tell me it don't say that. He gets all mad. So it never fails. Like you can talk smack all you want, but push comes to shove, whatever. I mean, I do this with Christians all the time. I was on. There was a Facebook post with David Wood and Sam Shimon, and they're just talking trash left and right. And the flood of comments was nonstop, hundreds and hundreds of people. So I'm like, there's no way he's going to ever see this. But I posted a couple of things about. This was about the Song of Solomon. Is Muhammad named in the Song of Solomon 5:16? So they're going to great lengths to say it's nonsense and blah, blah, blah. And they purposely mispronounce the Hebrew. That's one thing they do. And then they make fun of the word in Hebrew. And they ignore the I am on the end of Muhammad, because in Hebrew, the rabbi, which you can find this on the internet, the rabbi will say Muhammadim. Muhammadim is just like Elohim. It's like Salam Alaikum. It's the majestic plural of respectful address. But the I am in Hebrew specifically denotes a human being, because the Bible translated as altogether lovely, because they don't want you to know what it really means. And so this is the deception that Christians are forced into doing, where they don't tell you the truth, or they don't tell you at all what something says, and they just preach the line, oh, Jesus died for your sins, right? Anyway, but like I said, because I've been
yeah.
Anyway,
So where our time is up for the interview, but Alhamdulillah, I learned a lot myself and I really enjoyed that. So in the end, if you can just quickly give us your blog link so that people can check that out, and then we can end the interview on that note, inshallah. And I'll add the link in the description as well so people
Yeah.
can easily find it.
Yeah. Well, I'm on Facebook as Jonathan Ghaffar, so I'm easy to find. I'm the guy with the I Love Muhammad hat. I have a blog which is Jonathan M.A. Ghaffar, all together, no periods, JONAThanMAGHFFAR.blogspot.com. That's my blog.
Perfect.
So
Okay, brother. So in the end, I thank you for your time.
I want to pitch my book real quick.
Okay.
I do editing of books for people if they need editing done, but I'm in the middle of putting together a book on what I call Insights on Islam, a convert's search for God and spiritual truth. So I have an excerpt on my blog. You have to scroll down all the way to the bottom. But for like when I became Ahmadi, I started keeping notebooks of writing down all of the wow moments of me discovering something or some insight or whatever. But I also do this synchronicity thing where I open the Quran at random and I see what I get. And I always urge people to do that because you are always blessed by this direct guidance from Islam, from Allah. So I tell people I sort of got educated in Islam by this method of opening the Quran at random and getting this very direct kind of information or communication about God, his nature, what he wants from us. So I always tell people do this. And so this is the basis of the book that I'm hopefully going to come out with, hopefully before the end of the year. So anybody who wants a copy, you can email me, jonathanmag@gmail.com, and I can put you on the wait list or whatever. Anyway.
Okay, brother. So once again, I thank you for your time. In the end, we pray that Allah continues to guide the Muslims and the non-Muslims to the true Islam, Ahmadiyyat. Jazakallah, dear brother.
Jazakallah for all the effort you do, because I tell people this is the guy from Ahmadi Answers, one of the best sites out there.
Jazakallah, brother.
You're like fighting a good fight, no doubt.
Jazakallah, and we thank you once again.
Okay, all right. God bless. Assalamu Alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. If you have not yet subscribed, make sure to subscribe and click on the bell icon so you can get notifications for every new video. Also make sure to like and comment on the video and follow on Twitter and Instagram.
سفينا صل على محمد